and protect her. That wasn't the most efficient idea, though. Lissa had my classmates on hand. Others weren't so lucky. I thought about those students. Students like Jill. "Let's go to the elementary campus," I said. We set off at a light run, taking a route we hoped would keep us away from other Strigoi. I still had no idea how many we were dealing with here, and that was driving me crazy. When we were almost to the other campus, I felt the weird nausea hit me. I called a warning to Christian, just as a Strigoi grabbed him, but Christian was fast. Flames wreathed the Strigoi's head. He screamed and released Christian, trying frantically to put the flames out. The Strigoi never saw me coming with the stake. The whole thing took under a minute. Christian and I exchanged looks. Yeah, we were badasses. The elementary campus proved to be a center of activity. Strigoi and Guardians were actively fighting around the entrances to one of the dorms. For a moment, I froze. There were almost 20 Strigoi and half as many Guardians. So many Strigoi together. Until recently, we'd never heard of them banding together in such large numbers. We'd thought we'd disbanded a large group of them by killing Isaiah, but apparently that wasn't true. I allowed myself only a moment more of shock, and then we jumped into the fray. Emil was near a side entrance, fending off 3 Strigoi. He was battered and bruised, and the body of a 4th Strigoi lay at his feet. I lunged for one of the 3. She didn't see me coming, and I managed to stake her with almost no resistance. I was lucky. Christian, meanwhile, set flames to the others. Emil's face reflected surprise, but that didn't stop him from staking another of the Strigoi. I got the other. "You shouldn't have brought him here," Emil said as we moved to help another Guardian. "Moroi aren't supposed to get involved with this." "Moroi should have been involved with this a long time ago," said Christian through gritted teeth. We spoke little after that. The rest was a blur. Christian and I moved from fight to fight, combining his magic and my stake. Not all of our kills were as fast, and as easy as our early ones had been. Some fights were long and drawn out. Emil stuck with us, and I honestly lost count of how many Strigoi we took down. "I know you." The words startled me. In all this bloodshed, none of us, friend or foe, did much talking. The speaker was a Strigoi who looked to be my own age, but was probably at least 10 times older. He had shoulder-length blonde hair and eyes whose color I couldn't make out. They were ringed in red, which was all that mattered. My only answer was to swing out with my stake, but he dodged that. Christian was setting a couple of other Strigoi on fire, so I was handling this one on my own. "There's something strange about you now, but I still remember. I saw you years ago, before I was awakened." Okay, not 10 times my age, not if he'd seen me when he was a Moroi. I hoped his talking would distract him. He was actually pretty fast for a young Strigoi. "You were always with that Dragomir girl, the blonde." My foot hit him, and I jerked my kick back before he could grab me. He barely budged. "Her parents wanted you to be her guardian, right? Before they were all killed?" "I am her guardian," I grunted. My stake swiped dangerously close to him. "She's still alive, then?" "There were rumors that she died last year." There was a sense of wonder in his voice, which mixed weirdly with the malice. "You have no idea what kind of reward I'd get to take down the last living drag—" "Ugh!" He dodged my stake from hitting his chest again, but this time I managed an upward strike that dragged the stake's tip across his face. It wouldn't kill him there, but the touch of a stake, so filled with life, would feel like acid to the undead. He screamed, but it didn't slow his defenses. "I'll come back for you after I finish her," he snarled. "You'll never get near her," I growled back. Something shoved into me from the side, a Strigoi that Yuri was fighting. I stumbled, but managed to drive my stake through Yuri's Strigoi's heart before he could regain his balance. Yuri gasped his thanks, and then we both turned to other parts of the battle. Only the blonde Strigoi was gone. I couldn't find him anywhere. Another took his place, and as I moved toward that one, flames lit up around him, making him an easy mark for my stake. Christian had returned. "Christian, this Strigoi?" "I heard," he panted. "We have to go to her. He was messing with you. She's across campus, surrounded by novices and guardians. She'll be okay. But they need us here." I knew he was right, and I knew how hard it was for him to say that. Like me, he wanted to run off to Lissa. Despite all the good work he was doing here, I suspected he would rather have sunk all his magic into protecting her, keeping her ringed in a wall of fire no Strigoi could cross. I had no time to deeply investigate the bond, but I could sense the important things. She was alive, and she wasn't in pain. So I stayed on, fighting with Christian and Yuri. Lissa hovered at the back of my mind, the bond telling me she was okay. Aside from that, I let battle lust consume me. I had one goal, and one alone: kill Strigoi. I couldn't let them get into this dorm, nor could I let them leave this area and possibly go to Lissa's dorm. I lost track of time. Only the Strigoi I was currently fighting at any given moment mattered. And as soon as that one was gone, it was on to the next, until there wasn't a next one. I was sore and exhausted, adrenaline burning through my body. Christian stood beside me, panting. He hadn't engaged in physical combat like me, but he'd used a lot of magic tonight, and that had taken its own physical toll. I looked around. "We gotta find another one," I said. "There are no others," a familiar voice said. I turned and looked into Dimitri's face. He was alive. All the fear for him I'd held back burst through me. I wanted to throw myself at him and hold him as close to me as possible. He was alive. Battered and bloody, yes, but alive. His gaze held mine for just a moment, reminding me of what had happened in the cabin. It felt like 100 years ago, but in that brief glance I saw love and concern, and relief. He'd been worried about me, too. Then Dimitri turned and gestured to the eastern sky. I followed the motion. The horizon was pink and purple. It was nearly sunrise. "They're either dead or have run away," he told me. He glanced between Christian and me. "What you two did was stupid," I suggested. He shook his head. "One of the most amazing things I've ever seen. Half of those are yours." I looked back at the dorm, shocked at the number of bodies lying around it. We had killed Strigoi. We had killed a lot of them. Death and killing were horrible things, but I had liked doing what I just did. I had defeated the monsters who had come after me and those in my care. Then I noticed something. My stomach twisted. But it was nothing like my earlier Strigoi sensing feeling. This was caused by something entirely different. I turned back to Dimitri. "There are more than just Strigoi bodies there," I said in a small voice. "I know," he said. "We've lost a lot of people, in all senses of the word." Christian frowned. "What do you mean?" Dimitri's face was both hard and sad. "The Strigoi killed some Moroi and Dampiers, and some they carried away." Chapter 25. Dead or taken away. It wasn't enough that the Strigoi had come and attacked us, that they'd killed Moroi and Dampiers alike. They'd also carried some off. It was something Strigoi were known to do. Even they had limits on how much blood they could drink at once, so they'd often take prisoners to keep as snacks for later. Or sometimes a powerful Strigoi, who didn't want to do the dirty work, would send his or her minions off to bring back the prey. Every once in a while, They'd even purposely take back captives to turn into more Strigoi. Whatever the reason, it meant that some of our people might still be alive. Students, Moroi, and Dampier were gathered up once certain buildings had been declared Strigoi-free. Adult Moroi were herded inside with us, leaving the Guardians to assess the damage. I wanted desperately to be with them, to help and do my part, but they made it clear my part was over. There was nothing I could do at that point except wait and worry with the others. It still seemed unreal. Strigoi attacking our school. How could it have happened? The academy was safe. We'd always been taught that. It had to be safe. It was why our school years were so long, and why Moroi families endured being separated for most of the year. It was worth it for children to have a safe place to go. That was no longer true. It took only a couple hours for them to get a casualty count, but waiting while those reports trickled in felt like days. And the numbers were harsh. 15 Moroi had been killed. 12 Guardians had been killed. A group of 13, both Moroi and Dampiers, had been taken away. The Guardians estimated that there had been close to 50 Strigoi, which was beyond mind-boggling. They'd found 28 Strigoi bodies. The rest appeared to have escaped, many taking victims with them. For that size of a Strigoi party, our casualty count was still lower than one might have expected. A few things were credited for saving us. One was the early warning. The Strigoi had barely penetrated the school's inner grounds when I'd warned Stan. The school had gone into lockdown quickly, and the fact that most everyone was already inside for curfew had helped. Most of the Moroi victims, dead or taken, were those who had been out in the open when the Strigoi came. The Strigoi had never made it into the elementary dorms, which Dimitri said was largely thanks to me and Christian. They had managed to breach one of the Moroi dorms, however, the one that Lissa lived in. My stomach had dropped when I heard that, and even though I could feel that she was fine through the bond, all I could see was that smirking blonde Strigoi telling me he was going to finish the Dragomirs off. I didn't know what had happened to him. The attacking Strigoi group hadn't gotten far into her dorm, thankfully, but there had been casualties. One of them was Eddie. "What?" I exclaimed when Adrian told me. We were eating in the cafeteria. I wasn't sure which meal it was since the campus had reverted to a daylight schedule that threw my sense of timing off. The cafeteria was nearly silent, all conversations in low whispers. Meals were the only reason students could leave their dorms. There was going to be a Guardian meeting later on that I was actually invited to, but for now, I was confined with the rest of my friends. "He was with you guys," I said. I focused on Lissa, almost accusingly. "I saw him with you, through your eyes." She looked up at me over the tray of food she had no interest in eating, her face pale and full of grief. "When the Strigoi got in downstairs, he and some other novices went down to help." "They didn't find his body," said Adrian. There was no smirk on his face, no humor anywhere. "He was one of the ones they took." Christian sighed and leaned back in his chair. "He's as good as dead, then." The cafeteria disappeared. I stopped seeing any of them. All I could see in that moment was that room back in Spokane, that room where we'd been held. They'd tortured Eddie and nearly killed him. That experience had changed him forever, affecting the way he now conducted himself as a Guardian. He'd grown extremely dedicated as a result, but it had cost him some of the light and laughter he used to have. And now it was happening again. Eddie captured. He'd worked so hard to protect Lissa and others, risking his own life in the attack. I'd been nowhere near the Moroi dorm when it had happened, but I felt responsible, like I should have watched over him. Surely I owed it to Mason. Mason, who had died on my watch, and whose ghost I hadn't seen since he'd warned me earlier. I hadn't been able to save him, and now I'd lost his best friend, too. I shot up from my chair and shoved my tray away. That dark fury I'd been fighting blazed through me. If Strigoi had been around, I could have burned them up with it, without any need of Christian's magic. "What's wrong?" asked Lissa. I stared at her in disbelief. "What's wrong? What's wrong? Do you seriously have to ask that?" In the silent cafeteria, my voice rang out. People stared. "Rose, you know what she means," said Adrian, voice unusually calm. "We're all upset. Sit back down. It's going to be okay." For a moment, I almost listened to him. Then I shook it off. He was trying to use compulsion to chill me out. I glared at him. "It is not going to be okay. Not unless we do something about this." "There's nothing to be done," said Christian. Beside him, Lissa was silent, still hurt from when I had snapped at her. "We'll see about that," I said. "Rose, wait," she called. She was worried about me, and scared, too. It was tiny and selfish, but she didn't want me to leave her. She was used to me being there for her. I made her feel safe, but I couldn't stay. Not right now. I stormed out of the commons and into the bright light outside. The Guardians' meeting wasn't for another couple hours, but that didn't matter. I needed to talk to someone now. I sprinted to the Guardians' building. Someone else was walking into it as I was, and I bumped her in my haste. "Rose?" My fury turned to surprise. "Mom?" My famous guardian mother, Janine Hathaway, stood there by the door. She looked the same as she had when I'd seen her at New Year's, her curly red hair still worn short, and her face weathered from the sun. Her brown eyes seemed grimmer than last time, however, which was saying something. "What are you doing here?" I asked. As I'd told Deirdre, my mother and I had a troubled relationship for most of my life, largely because of the distance that inevitably came with having a parent who was a guardian. I'd resented her for years, and we still weren't super close, but she'd been there for me after Mason's death, and I think we both tentatively hoped things might improve in coming years. She'd left after New Year's, and last I'd heard, she'd gone back to Europe with the Seltskys she guarded. She opened the door and I followed her through. Her manner was brusque and businesslike as always. "Replenishing the numbers. They've called in extras to reinforce campus." Replenishing the numbers. Replacing the Guardians who had been killed. All the bodies had been cleared away. Strigoi, Moroi, and Dampier alike. But the hole left behind by those who were gone was apparent to all. I could still see them when I closed my eyes, but with her here, I realized I had an opportunity. I grabbed hold of her arm, which startled her. "We have to go after them," I said. "Rescue the ones who were taken." She regarded me carefully, a small frown the only sign of her feelings. "We don't do that kind of thing. You know that. We have to protect those who are here." "What about those 13? Shouldn't we protect them? And you went on a rescue mission once." She shook her head. "That was different. We had a trail. We wouldn't know where to find this group if we wanted to." I knew she was right. The Strigoi wouldn't have left an easy path to follow. And yet, suddenly I had an idea. "They put the wards back up, right?" I asked. "Yes, almost immediately. We're still not sure how they were broken. There were no stakes used to pierce them." I started to tell her my theory about that, but she wasn't up to speed with my ghostly shenanigans. "Do you know where Dimitri is?" She gestured toward groups of Guardians hurrying all around. "I'm sure he's busy here somewhere. Everyone is. And now I need to go check in. I know you were invited to the meeting, but that's not for a while yet. You should stay out of the way." "I will," But I need to see Dmitri first. It's important. It might play a role in what happens at the meeting. What is it? She asked, suspiciously. I can't explain yet. It's complicated. It'd take too much time. Help me find him, and we'll tell you later. My mother didn't seem happy about this. After all, Janine Hathaway wasn't someone people usually said no to. But she nonetheless helped me find Dmitri. After the events over winter break, I think she'd come to regard me as more than a hapless teenager. We found Dmitri with some other guardians, studying a map of campus and planning how to distribute the newly arrived guardians. There were enough people gathered around the map that he was able to slip away. What's going on? He asked as he and I stood off to the side of the room. Even in the midst of this crisis, in the midst of worrying so much about others, I could tell that there was part of him that worried just about me. Are you okay? I think we should launch a rescue mission, I said. You know we don't usually do that, yeah, and I know we don't know where they are, except I might. He frowned. How? I told him how it had been Mason who'd warned us last night. Dmitri and I had had no time to talk alone since then, so we'd never really debriefed on the events of the attack. We also hadn't really had a chance to talk about what had happened in the cabin. It made me feel weird because really, that was all I wanted to think about. But I couldn't. Not with so much else going on. So I kept trying to shove those memories of sex away, only to have them keep popping up and entangle my emotions further. Hoping I seemed cool and competent, I continued explaining my ideas. Mason's locked out now because the wards are back up, but somehow, I think he knows where the Strigoi are. I think he could show us where they are. Dimitri's face told me he had his doubts about this. Come on! You have to believe me after what happened. I'm still having a hard time with that, he admitted. But okay. Suppose this is true. You think he can just lead us? You can ask him and he'll do it? Yeah, I said. I think I can. I've been fighting him all this time, but I think if I actually try to work with him, he'll help. I think that's what he's always wanted. He knew the wards were weak, and that the Strigoi had been lying in wait. The Strigoi can't be too far away from us. They had to have stopped for daylight and hidden out somewhere. We might be able to get to them before the captives die. And once we get close enough, I can actually find them. I then explained the nauseous feeling I'd gotten when Strigoi were around. Dmitri didn't challenge this. I think too many weird things were going on for him to even question it. But Mason isn't here. You said he can't get through the wards. How will you get him to help us? He asked. I'd been thinking about this. Take me to the front gates. After a quick word to Alberta about investigating something, Dmitri led me outside, and we walked the long way to the entrance to the school. Neither of us said anything as we walked. Even in the midst of all this, I still kept thinking of the cabin, of being in his arms. In some ways, it was part of what helped me cope with all the rest of this horror. I had a feeling it was on his mind, too. The entrance to the school consisted of a long stretch of iron fence that lay right on top of the wards. A road that wound from the main highway 20 miles away came up to the gate, which was almost always kept closed. Guardians had a small booth here, and the area was monitored at all times of the day. They were surprised by our request, but Dmitri insisted it would just be for a moment. They slid the heavy gate open, revealing a space only big enough for one person to get through at a time. Dmitri and I stepped outside. A headache almost immediately built up behind my eyes, and I started to see faces and shapes. It was just like at the airport. When I was outside of wards, I could see all sorts of spirits. But I understood it now, and no longer feared it. I needed to control it. Go away, I said to the gray, looming forms around me. "I don't have time for you. Go!" I put as much force as I could into my will and my voice, and to my astonishment, the ghosts faded. A faint hum remained with me, reminding me they were still out there, and I knew if I let down my guard even a moment, it would all hit me again. Dmitri was eyeing me with concern. "You're okay?" I nodded and peered around. There was one ghost I wanted to see. "Mason," I said. "I need you." Nothing. I summoned back up the command I'd used on the other ghosts just a moment ago. "Mason, please, come here." I saw nothing except the road in front of us winding off into the winter-dead hills. Dmitri was giving me that look from last night, the one that said he was deeply concerned for my mental health. And actually, I was worried at that moment too. Last night's warning had been the final proof for me that Mason was real. But now... A minute later, his shape materialized before me, looking a little paler than before. For the first time since all this had begun, I was happy to see him. He, of course, looked sad. Same old, same old. "Finally, you were making me look bad." He simply stared, and I immediately felt bad for joking. "I'm sorry. I need your help again. We have to find them. We have to save Eddie." He nodded. "Can you show me where they are?" He nodded again and turned, pointing off in a direction that was almost directly behind me. "They came in through the back of campus?" He nodded yet again, and like that, I knew what had happened. I knew how the Strigoi had gotten in, but there was no time to dwell on that just now. I turned to Dmitri. "We need a map," I said. He walked back through the gate and spoke a few words to one of the guardians on duty. A moment later, he returned with a map and unfolded it. It showed the layout of campus, as well as the surrounding roads and terrain. I took it from him and held it out to Mason, trying to keep it flat in the whipping wind. The only true road out from the school was right in front of us. The rest of the campus was surrounded by forests and steep cliffs. I pointed to a spot at the back of the school's grounds. "This is where they came in, isn't it? Where the wards first broke?" Mason nodded. He held out his finger and, without touching the map, traced a route through the woods that flanked the edge of a small mountain. Following it long enough eventually led to a small dirt road that joined an interstate many miles away. I followed where he pointed and suddenly had my doubts about using him as a guide. "No, that's not right," I said. "It can't be. This stretch of woods by the mountain has no roads. They'd have to go on foot, and it'd take too long to walk from the school to this other road. They wouldn't have had enough time. They'd be caught in daylight." Mason shook his head, to disagree with me apparently, and again traced the route back and forth. In particular, he kept pointing to a spot not far beyond the academy's grounds. At least, it wasn't far away on the map. The map wasn't particularly detailed, and I guessed the spot was probably a few miles away. He held his finger there, looked at me, and then looked back down. "They can't be there now," I argued. "It's outside. They might have come in through the back, but they had to have left through the front, gotten in some kind of vehicle and took off." Mason shook his head. I looked up at Dmitri, frustrated. I felt like the clock was ticking on us, and Mason's weird assertion that the Strigoi were a few miles away, outdoors in the daytime, was stirring up my irritable nature. I sincerely doubted they'd gotten out tents and were camping. "Is there any building or anything out there?" I demanded, pointing at the spot Mason had indicated. "He says they were going out to that road, but they couldn't have walked there before the sun came up, and he claims they're there." Dmitri's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Not that I know of." He took the map from me and brought it to the other guardians to check with them. While they talked, I glanced back at Mason. "You better be right about this," I warned. He nodded. Have you seen them? The Strigoi and their captives?" He nodded. "Is Eddie still alive?" He nodded, and Dmitri walked over. "Rose?" There was a strange sound to Dmitri's voice as he brought the map back, like he couldn't entirely believe what he was saying. "Steven says there are caves right at the base of the mountain here." I met Dmitri's eyes, no doubt looking just as astonished as he did. "Are they big enough?" "Big enough for the Strigoi to hide out in until nighttime?" Dmitri nodded. "They are, and they're only 5 miles away." Chapter 26. It was almost impossible to believe. The Strigoi were practically right next door to us, waiting for nightfall so they could finish their escape. Apparently, in the chaos of the attack, some of the Strigoi had obscured their tracks while others had made it look as though they might have exited through any number of points on campus. Caught up in their own aftermath, no one had given it much thought. The wards had been restored. As far as we were concerned, the Strigoi were gone, and that was what mattered. Now, we had an odd situation before us. Under normal circumstances, not that a massive Strigoi attack was normal, we would have never pursued them. Those kidnapped by Strigoi were usually written off as dead, and, as my mother had pointed out, guardians rarely knew where to look for Strigoi. This time, however, we knew. The Strigoi were essentially trapped. It presented an interesting dilemma. Well, it wasn't a dilemma to me. I honestly couldn't figure out why we weren't in those caves right now, flushing out the Strigoi and looking for survivors. Dmitri and I hurried back, anxious to act on our news, but we had to wait until all the guardians gathered. "Do not interrupt them," Dmitri told me as we were about to walk into the meeting that would decide our next course of action. We stood near the doorway, speaking in low voices. "I know how you feel. I know what you want to do, but ranting at them isn't going to help you get your way." "Ranting?" I exclaimed, forgetting to speak softly. "I see it," he said. "That fire's in you again. You want to tear somebody apart. It's what made you so deadly in the fight. But we're not fighting right now. The Guardians have all the information. They'll make the right choice. You just have to be patient." Part of what he said was true. In preparation for the meeting, we had relayed our information and then done some more searching. Investigation had revealed that several years ago, one of the Moroi teachers had taught a geology class and mapped the caves out, providing us with everything we needed to know about them. The entrance was 5 miles from the academy's back borders. The cave's longest chamber was about a half a mile long, the far side letting out about 20 miles from the dirt road on the map. It had been believed that landslides had blocked both entrances. Now, we realized, clearing those out wouldn't be too difficult with Strigoi strength. But I wasn't sure I trusted what Dmitri said about the Guardians making the right choice. Minutes before the meeting began, I appealed to my mother. "Please," I told her, "we have to do this." She looked me over. "If there's a rescue, it's not going to be a we thing. You aren't going." "Why? Because our numbers are so badass the first time that no Guardians died?" She flinched. "You know I can help. You know what I did. I'm a week away from my birthday, and only a few months away from graduation. You think something magical's going to happen before then? I've got a few more things to learn, yeah, but I don't think that's big enough to stop me from helping. You guys need as much help as you can get, and there are plenty of other novices who are ready too. Bring Christian, and we'll be unstoppable." "No," she said quickly. "Not him. You should have never gotten a Moroi involved, let alone one as young as him. But you saw what he can do. She didn't argue that. I saw the indecision on her face. She glanced at the time and sighed. Let me check something. I didn't know where she went, but she was 15 minutes late for the meeting. By then, Alberta had already debriefed the Guardians on what we'd learned. Mercifully, she skipped the details about how we'd gotten our data, so we didn't have to waste time explaining the ghost part. The cave's layout was examined in detail. People asked questions. Then decision time came. I braced myself. Fighting Strigoi had always meant relying on a defense strategy. We attacked only when attacked. Previous arguments for an offensive had always failed. I expected the same now. Only it didn't come. One by one, the Guardians stood up and expressed their commitment to going on the rescue mission. As they did, I saw that fire Dimitri had spoken of. Everyone was ready for a fight. They wanted it. The Strigoi had gone too far. In our world, there were only a handful of places that were safe: the royal court and our academies. Children were sent to places like St. Vladimir's with the certainty they would be protected. That certainty had been shattered, and we wouldn't stand for that, especially if we could still save lives. An eager, victorious feeling burned in my chest. Well, then, said Alberta, glancing around. I think she was as surprised as I was, though she too had been in favor of a rescue. We'll plan the logistics and head out. We've still got about 9 hours of daylight to go after them before they leave. Wait, said my mother, standing up. All eyes turned to her, but she didn't bat an eyelash under the scrutiny. She looked fierce and capable, and I was immensely proud of her. I think there's one thing we should consider. I think we should allow some of the senior novices to go. This started a small outcry, but it only came from a minority. My mother gave an argument similar to what I had given her. She also maintained that novices would not be in the front lines, but that we would serve more as backup should any Strigoi get through. The Guardians had almost approved of this idea when she dropped another bomb on them. I think we should bring some Moroi with us. Celeste shot up. She had a huge gash on the side of her face. It made the bruise I'd seen on her the other day seem like a mosquito bite. What, are you insane? My mother fixed her with a calm look. No. We all know what Rose and Christian Ozara did. One of our biggest problems with Strigoi is getting past their strength and speed to go in for the kill. If we bring fire-using Moroi, we have a distraction that will give us an edge. We can cut them down. A debate broke out. It took every ounce of self-control I had not to join in. I remembered Dimitri's words about not interrupting. Yet as I listened, I couldn't help my frustration. Every minute that passed was another minute we weren't going after Eddie and the others. It was another minute in which someone might die. I turned to where Dimitri sat beside me. They're being idiots, I hissed. His eyes were on Alberta, as she debated a guardian who usually worked the elementary campus. No, murmured Dimitri. Watch. Change is happening before your eyes. People are going to remember this day as a turning point. And he was right. Once again, the Guardians slowly signed on with the idea. I think it was part of that same initiative that made them want to fight in the first place. We had to get back at the Strigoi. This was more than our fight. It was the Moroi's, too. When my mother said she'd gotten a number of teachers to volunteer, they absolutely wouldn't allow students for this. The decision was made. The Guardians were going after the Strigoi, and novices and Moroi would go with them. I felt triumphant and exultant. Dimitri was right. This was the moment our world would change, but not for 4 hours. More Guardians are coming, Dimitri told me when I once again expressed my outrage. In 4 hours, the Strigoi could have decided to have a snack. We need an overwhelming show of force, he said. We need every edge we can get. Yes, the Strigoi could kill a couple more before we get there. I don't want that, believe me. But if we go in unprepared, we could lose more lives than that. My blood boiled. I knew he was right, and there was nothing I could do about it. I hated that. I hated being helpless. Come on, he said, gesturing toward the exit. Let's take a walk. Where? It doesn't matter. We just need to get you calmed down, or you'll be in no shape to fight. Yeah? Are you afraid of my possibly insane dark side coming out? No, I'm afraid of your normal Rose Hathaway side coming out, the one that isn't afraid to jump in without thinking when she believes something is right. I gave him a dry look. Is there a difference? Yes. The second one scares me. I resisted the urge to elbow him. For half a heartbeat, I wished I could close my eyes and forget about all the hurt and bloodshed around us. I wanted to lounge in bed with him, laughing and teasing, with neither of us worried about anything else except each other. That wasn't real, though. This was. Won't they need you here? I asked. No. Most of what they're doing now is waiting for the others, and they have more than enough people right now to help plan the attack. Your mother's leading that. I followed his gaze to where my mom stood, in the center of a group of guardians, pointing with sharp, forceful motions toward what looked like maps. I still never quite knew what to think about her, but watching her now, I couldn't help but admire her dedication. There was none of the dysfunctional annoyance I usually experienced around her. Okay, I said. Let's go. He took me on a loop around campus, and we surveyed some of the aftermath. Most of the damage wasn't to the campus itself, of course. It was to our people. Still, we could see some signs of the attack. Damage to buildings, bloodstains in unexpected places, etc. Most noticeable of all was the mood. Even in full daylight, there was a darkness around us, a heavy sorrow that you could almost reach out and feel. I saw it on the faces of everyone we passed. I half expected Dimitri to take me through where some of the injured were. He steered clear of that, however, and I could guess why. Lissa was helping out there, using her powers in small doses to heal the wounded. Adrian was as well, though he couldn't do nearly as much as her. They'd finally decided that it was worth risking everyone knowing about Spirit. The tragedy here was too great. Besides, so much about Spirit had gotten out at the trial that it had probably only been a matter of time anyway. Dimitri didn't want me near Lissa while she was using her magic, which I found interesting. He still didn't know if I was really catching her madness, but he apparently didn't want to take any chances. You told me you had a theory about why the wards broke, he said. We'd extended our circuit of campus, not far from where Jesse's society had met last night. I'd nearly forgotten. Once I'd pieced it together, the reason had been perfectly obvious. No one had really asked many questions about it, not yet. The immediate concerns had been to get new wards up and tend to our own people. The investigation would occur later. Jesse's group was doing their initiation right here by the wards. You know how stakes can negate wards because the elements go against each other? I think it's the same thing. Their initiation rites used all the elements, and I think they negated the wards in the same way. Magic is used all the time on campus, though, pointed out Dimitri. In all the elements. Why has this never happened before? Because the magic isn't usually happening right on top of the wards. The wards are on the edges, so the two don't usually conflict. Also, I think it makes a difference in how the elements are being used. Magic is life, which is why it destroys Strigoi and why they can't cross it. The magic in stakes is used as a weapon. So was the magic in the torture session. When it's used in that sort of a negative way, I think it cancels out good magic. I shivered, recalling that sickening feeling I'd felt when Lissa had used spirit to torment Jessie. It hadn't been natural. Dimitri stared at a broken fence that marked one of the academy's boundaries. Incredible. I never would have thought that was possible, but it makes sense. The principle really is the same as for the stakes. He smiled at me. You've thought about this a lot. I don't know. It just sort of all fell together in my head. I glowered, thinking of Jessie's idiotic group. Bad enough they'd done what they did to Lissa. That was enough to make me want to kick their asses, though not kill them anymore. I'd learned some restraint since last night. But this, letting Strigoi into the school? How could something so stupid and petty on their part have led to this sort of disaster? It almost would have been better if they'd tried to make this happen, but no. It had come about through their glory-seeking game. Idiots, I muttered. The wind picked up. I shivered, and this time it was from the chilly temperature, not my own unease. Spring might be coming, but it certainly wasn't here yet. Let's get back inside, Dimitri said. We turned around, and as we walked toward the heart of the secondary campus, I saw it, the cabin. Neither of us slowed down or obviously looked at it, but I knew he was just as acutely aware of it as I was. He proved it when he spoke a moment later. Rose, about what happened. I groaned. I knew it. I knew this was going to happen. He glanced over at me, startled. That what was going to happen? This. The part where you give me the huge lecture about how what we did was wrong, and how we shouldn't have done it, and how it's never going to happen again. Until the words left my mouth, I didn't realize how much I'd feared he would say that. He still looked shocked. Why would you think that? Because that's how you are, I told him. I think I sounded a little hysterical. You always want to do the right thing, and when you do the wrong thing, you then have to fix it and do the right thing. And I know you're going to say that what we did shouldn't have happened, and that you wish... The rest of what I might have said was smothered as Dimitri wrapped his arm around my waist and pulled me to him in the shadow of a tree. Our lips met, and as we kissed, I forgot all about my worries and fears that he'd say what we'd done was a mistake. I even, as impossible as it seems, forgot about the death and destruction of the Strigoi, just for a moment. When we finally broke apart, he still kept me close to him. I don't think what we did was wrong, he said softly. I'm glad we did it. If we could go back in time, I'd do it again. A swirling feeling burned within my chest. Really? What made you change your mind? Because you're hard to resist, he said, clearly amused at my surprise. And, do you remember what Rhonda said? There was another shock, hearing her brought up. But then I recalled his face when he'd listened to her and what he'd said about his grandmother. I tried to remember Rhonda's exact words. Something about how you're going to lose something. I apparently didn't remember it so well. You will lose what you value most, so treasure it while you can. Naturally, he knew it word for word. I'd scoffed at the words at the time, but now I tried to decipher them. At first, I felt a surge of joy. I was what he valued most. Then I gave him a startled look. Wait, you think I'm going to die? That's why you slept with me? No, of course not. I did what I did because, believe me, it wasn't because of that. Regardless of the specifics, or if it's even true, she was right about how easily things can change. We try to do what's right, or rather, what others say is right. But sometimes, when that goes against who we are, You have to choose. Even before the Strigoi attack, as I watched all the problems you were struggling with, I realized how much you meant to me. It changed everything. I was worried about you. So worried. You have no idea. And it became useless to try to act like I could ever put any Moroi life above yours. It's not going to happen, no matter how wrong others say it is. And so I decided that's something I have to deal with. Once I made that decision, there was nothing to hold us back. He hesitated, seeming to replay his words as he brushed my hair from my face. Well, to hold me back. I'm speaking for myself. I don't mean to act like I know exactly why you did it. I did it because I love you, I said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, and really it was. He laughed. You can sum up in one sentence what it takes me a whole speech to get out. Because it's that simple. I love you, and I don't want to keep pretending like I don't. I don't either. His hand dropped from my face and found my hand. Fingers entwined, we began walking again. I don't want any more lies. Then what'll happen now? With us, I mean. Once all of this is done. With the Strigoi. Well, as much as I hate to reinforce your fears, you were right about one thing. We can't be together again. For the rest of the school year, that is. We're going to have to keep our distance. I felt a little disappointed by this, but I knew with certainty he was right. We might finally have reached the point where we weren't going to deny our relationship anymore, but we could hardly flaunt it while I was still his student. Our feet splashed through slush. A few scattered birds sang in the trees, undoubtedly surprised to see so much activity and daylight around here. Dimitri stared off into the sky ahead, face thoughtful. After you graduate and are out with Lissa. He didn't finish. It took me a moment, but I realized what he was about to say. My heart nearly stopped. You're going to ask to be reassigned, aren't you? You won't be her guardian. It's the only way we can be together. But we won't actually be together, I pointed out. Us staying with her gives us the same problem, me worrying more about you than her. She needs 2 guardians perfectly dedicated to her. If I can get assigned somewhere at court, we'll be near each other all the time. And in a secure place like that, there's more flexibility with a guardian schedule. A whiny, selfish part of me wanted to immediately jump in with how much that sucked, but really, it didn't. There was no option we had that was ideal. Each one came with hard choices. I knew it was hard for him to give up Lissa. He cared about her and wanted to keep her safe with a passion that almost rivaled my own. But he cared about me more, and he had to make that sacrifice if he still wanted to honor his sense of duty. Well, I said, realizing something. We might actually see more of each other if we were guarding different people. We can get time off together. If we were both with Lissa, we'd be swapping shifts and always be apart. The trees were thinning up ahead, which was a shame because I didn't want to let go of his hand. Still, a surge of hope and joy began to blossom in my chest. It felt wrong in the wake of such tragedy, but I couldn't help it. After all this time, after all the heartache, Dimitri and I were going to make this work. There was always the possibility he could get assigned away from the court, but even so, we'd still manage to get some time off together every once in a while. The time apart would be agony, but we would make it work, and it would be better than continuing to live a lie. Yes, it was really going to happen. All of Deirdre's worries about me coping with conflicting pieces of my life would be for nothing. I was going to have it all, Lissa and Dimitri. The thought that I could be with both of them was going to make me strong. It would carry me through this Strigoi attack. I'd tuck it away in the back of my mind, like a good luck charm. Dimitri and I didn't say anything else for a while. Like always, we didn't have to. I knew he was feeling the same happy buzz I was, despite that stoic exterior. We were almost out of the forest, back in sight of the others, when he spoke again. "You'll be 18 soon, but even so," he sighed. "When this comes out, a lot of people aren't going to be happy." "Yeah? Well, they can deal. Rumors and gossip I could handle. I also have a feeling your mother's going to have a very ugly conversation with me." "You're about to face down Strigoi, and my mother's the one you're scared of?" I could see a smile playing at his lips. "She's a force to be reckoned with. Where do you think you got it from?" I laughed. "It's a wonder you bother with me, then." "You're worth it, believe me." He kissed me again, using the last of the forest's shadows for cover. In a normal world, this would have been a happy, romantic walk the morning after sex. We wouldn't be preparing for battle and worrying about our loved ones. We'd be laughing and teasing each other while secretly planning our next romantic getaway. We didn't live in a normal world, of course, but in this kiss, it was easy to imagine we did. He and I reluctantly broke apart and left the woods, heading back toward the Guardian's building. Dark times were ahead of us, but with his kiss still burning on my lips, I felt like I could do anything, even face down a pack of Strigoi. Chapter 27. None of the others appeared to have noticed our absence. More Guardians, as promised, had shown up, and now we had almost 50. It was a veritable army, and much as with the Strigoi, the numbers were unprecedented, aside from old European legends of great epic battles between our races. We had more Guardians on campus, but some had to stay behind to protect the school. A lot of my classmates had been drafted for that duty, but about 10 or so, including me, were accompanying the others to the cave. An hour before departure, we met again to go over the plan. There was a large chamber near the far side of the cave, and it made the most sense for the Strigoi to be there so they could head out right away once night came. We were going to attack from both ends. 15 Guardians would go in from each side, accompanied by 3 Moroi each. 10 Guardians would remain at each entrance to hold back any escaping Strigoi. I was assigned to watch the entrance on the far side. Dimitri and my mother were part of the groups actually going inside. I wished desperately that I could have been with them, but I knew I was lucky to be along at all, and on a mission like this, every job was important. Our little army set out, moving at a brisk pace to cover the 5 miles. We figured that it would take a little over an hour, and there would still be enough daylight for the fight and return trip. No Strigoi would be stationed outside on guard duty, so we could reach the caves undetected. Once our people were inside, however, it was almost a given that the Strigoi's superior hearing would immediately alert them to the attack. There was little conversation as we approached. No one felt like chatting, and most talk was of a logistical nature. I walked with the novices, but every once in a while I'd glance over and meet Dimitri's eyes. I felt like there was an invisible bond between us now, so thick and intense that it was a wonder everyone couldn't see it. His face was battle-serious, but I saw the smile in his eyes. Our group split when we reached the closest entrance to the cave. Dimitri and my mother were going in here, and as I gave them one last glance, my feelings had little to do with my earlier romantic interlude. Everything I felt was worry I'd never see them again. I had to remind myself that they were tough, 2 of the best Guardians out there. If anyone would come out of this, it was them. I was the one who needed to be careful, and as we walked the half-mile around the mountain's base, I carefully placed my emotions in a small compartment in the back of my mind. They'd have to stay there until this was over, I was in battle mode now and couldn't let my feelings distract me. When we were almost to our entrance, I caught a silvery flash out of the corner of my eye. I'd been keeping the assorted ghostly images that lived outside of the wards away, but this was one I wanted to see. Glancing over, I saw Mason. He stood there, saying nothing, wearing his perpetually sad expression. He still seemed unusually pale to me. As our group passed by, he held up one hand. As a farewell or benediction, I didn't know. At the cave's entrance, our group split up. Alberta and Stan were leading the group in. They stood poised at the entrance, waiting for the exact time they'd agreed upon with the other group. Ms. Carmack, my magic teacher, was among the Moroi going in with them. She looked nervous but determined. The moment came and the adults disappeared. The rest of us stood there, lined up in a ring around the cave. Gray clouds hung in the sky. The sun had begun its descent, but we still had a while. "This is going to be easy," murmured Meredith, one of 3 other girls in the senior class. She spoke uncertainly, more to herself than to me, I think. "A slam dunk. They'll take out the Strigoi before any of them realize it. We won't have to do anything." I hoped she was right. I was ready to fight, but if I didn't have to, it'd mean everything had gone as planned. We waited. There was nothing else to do. Every minute felt like an eternity. Then we heard it. The sounds of fighting. Muffled cries and grunts, a few screams, all of us tensed, bodies so rigid we nearly snapped. Emil was our leader on this, and he stood closest to the entrance, stake in hand and sweat forming on his brow as he peered into the darkness, ready for any sign of a Strigoi. A few minutes into it, we heard the sound of footsteps running toward us. Our stakes were ready. Emil and another guardian drew closer to the entrance, ready to jump in and kill the fleeing Strigoi. But it wasn't a Strigoi who came out. It was Abby Bodica. She was scraped up and dirty, but otherwise she was alive. Her face was frantic and streaked with tears. At first, she screamed when she saw all of us. Then she realized who we were and collapsed into the arms of the first person she could get to, Meredith. Meredith looked surprised, but she gave Abby a hug of reassurance. "It's okay," Meredith said. "Everything's okay. You're in the sun." Gently, Meredith unwrapped Abby and led her to a nearby tree. Abby sat at its base, burying her face in her hands. Meredith returned to her position. I wanted to comfort Abby. I think we all did, but it would have to wait. A minute later, another Moroi came out. It was Mr. Ellsworth, the teacher I'd had in 5th grade. He, too, looked worn, and his neck showed puncture marks. The Strigoi had used him for feeding, but hadn't killed him yet. Nonetheless, despite what horrors he must have faced, Mr. Ellsworth was calm, his eyes alert and watchful. He recognized the situation and immediately stepped out of our circle. "What's going on in there?" asked Emil, his eyes on the cave. Some of the guardians had earpieces, but I imagined in the midst of battle it was hard to report back. "It's a mess," said Mr. Ellsworth, "but we're getting away, in both directions. It's hard to tell who's fighting who, but the Strigoi are distracted, and someone," he frowned, "I saw someone using fire on the Strigoi." None of us answered. It was too complex to get into right now. He seemed to realize that and withdrew to sit near a still sobbing Abby. 2 more Moroi and a Dampier I didn't know soon joined Abby and Mr. Ellsworth. Each time someone came out, I prayed it would be Eddie. We had 5 victims so far, and I had to assume that others were escaping at the entrance closest to the school. Several minutes passed, though, and no one else came out. My shirt was drenched, soaked through with sweat. I had to shift my hold on the stake every once in a while. My grip was so tight that my fingers were locking up. Suddenly, I saw Emil flinch. I realized he was getting a message through his earpiece. His face showed intense concentration, and then he murmured something back. Looking up at us, he pointed at 3 novices. "You, take them back to the school." He gestured at the refugees and then turned toward 3 of the adult guardians. "Go in. Most of the prisoners have gotten out, but our people are trapped. There's a stalemate." The guardians moved in without hesitation, and a few moments later, the novices and their charges took off. That left 4 of us, 2 adults, Emil and Stephen, and 2 novices, me and Shane. The tension around us was so thick we could barely breathe. No one else was coming out. No more reports were being made. Emil glanced up and looked alarmed. I followed his gaze. More time had passed than I realized. The sun was significantly lower. Emil suddenly flinched again as another message came through. He looked at all of us, his face troubled. "We need more in there to cover the escape on the other end. It doesn't sound like we've lost many. They're still just having trouble with the retreat." Many, he'd said. Not any. That meant we'd lost at least 1 person. I felt cold all over. "Stephen, you go in," said Emil. He hesitated, and I could read his dilemma like a book. He wanted to go in too, but as the leader for this side, he was supposed to stay stationed here until the last possible moment. He was on the verge of disobeying those orders, I realized. He was considering going in with Stephen and leaving Shane and me out here. Yet, at the same time, he couldn't bring himself to leave 2 novices here alone, should something unexpected happen. Emil exhaled, and he looked us over. "Rose, go with him." I didn't waste a moment. Following Stephen, I slipped into the cave, and immediately that nauseous feeling rolled over me. It had been cold outside, but it was colder still as we moved deeper. It was also darker. Our eyes could handle a fair amount of it, but it soon became too much. He flipped on a small light attached to his jacket. "I wish I could tell you what to do, but I don't know what we'll find," he told me. "Be ready for anything." The darkness in front of us began to fade. The sounds grew louder. We picked up the pace, glancing in all directions. Suddenly, we found ourselves in the large chamber shown on the map. A fire burned in one corner. One the Strigoi had made, not anything magical. That was providing the light. Looking around, I immediately saw what had happened. Part of the wall had fallen in, creating a pile of stones. No one had been crushed under it, but it had almost entirely blocked the opening to the other side of the cave. I didn't know if magic had caused it, or if the fighting had. Maybe it had been a coincidence. Whatever the reason, 7 guardians, including Dimitri and Alberta, were trapped now by 10 Strigoi. No Moroi fire users had been caught on this side, but the flashes of light coming through the opening in the cave-in showed me that they were still fighting on the other side. I saw bodies lying on the floor. 2 were Strigoi, but I couldn't make out the others. The problem was obvious. Getting through the opening would require someone practically crawling. It would put the person in a vulnerable position. This meant these Strigoi needed to be taken out before the Guardians could make their escape. Stephen and I were going to help even the odds. We came up from behind the Strigoi, but 3 of them sensed us somehow and turned toward us. 2 jumped at Stephen, and the other came at me. Instantly, I kicked into battle mode. All the rage and frustration poured out through me. The cave made for close fighting quarters, but I was still able to evade him. In fact, the close space was to my advantage, because the Strigoi, with his larger size, had trouble ducking and dodging. I stayed out of his reach mostly, though he did grab hold of me long enough to slam me against the wall. I didn't even feel it. I just kept moving, going on the offensive. I eluded his next attack, got in some blows of my own, and, with my small size, managed to slip down and stake him before his next hit. I pulled out the blade in one smooth motion and went to help Stephen. He had taken out one of his attackers, and between us, we finished the last one. That left 7 Strigoi now. No, 6. The trapped guardians who were having difficulty in their pinned position had killed another. Stephen and I jerked the Strigoi closest to us out of the circle. He was a strong one, very old, very powerful. And even with the 2 of us, he was hard to take down. At last we did. With the Strigoi numbers reduced, the other guardians were having an easier time getting to the rest. They started freeing themselves from their trapped position, and their numbers alone were now an aid. When the Strigoi count was down to 2, Alberta yelled at us to start escaping. Our alignment in the room had changed. We were now the ones surrounding the last 2 Strigoi. This left the path clear for 3 of the guardians to escape via the way I'd come in. Stephen, meanwhile, crawled through the hole to the other side. Dimitri staked one of the 2 Strigoi. 1 left. Stephen stuck his head back in and shouted something to Alberta that I couldn't quite make out. She yelled something back without looking at him. She, Dimitri, and 2 others were closing in on the last Strigoi. "Rose!" yelled Stephen, beckoning. Follow orders. That's what we did. I left the fray, scrambling through the hole more easily than he had, thanks to my smaller size. Another guardian immediately followed after me. No one was on this side of the cave-in. The fight had either ended or moved on. Bodies showed that things had been intense, however. I saw more Strigoi, as well as a familiar face. Yori. I hastily looked away toward Stephen, who was helping another guardian through. Alberta came next. "They're dead," she called. "It sounds like there are a few more blocking the retreat down here. Let's finish this before the sun comes up." Dimitri came last of all through the gap. He and I exchanged brief, relieved glances, and then we were on the move. This was the long part of the tunnel, and we hurried down it, anxious to get our remaining people out. At first, we encountered nothing, and then flashes of light indicated a fight up ahead. Ms. Carmack and my mother were fighting 3 Strigoi. My group closed in, and in seconds, the Strigoi were down. "That's it for this group," my mother gasped out. I was grateful to see her alive, too. "But I think there are more here than we thought. I think they left some behind when they went to attack the school. The rest of our people that survived have already made it out." "There are other branches in the cave," said Alberta. "Strigoi could be hiding in there." My mother agreed. "They could be. Some know they're overwhelmed and are just going to wait us out and escape later. Others may come for us." "What do we do?" asked Stephen. "Finish them off, or retreat?" We turned to Alberta. She made a quick decision. "We retreat. We got as many as we could, and the sun is dropping. We need to get behind the wards." We took off, so close to victory, fueled by the disappearing light. Dimitri was beside me as we moved. "Did Eddie get out?" I hadn't seen his body, but I hadn't been paying much attention either. "Yes," said Dimitri, breathing ragged. God only knew how many Strigoi he'd fought today. "We had to practically force him out. He wanted to fight." That sounded like Eddie. "I remember this curve," my mother said as we rounded a corner. "It's not much farther. We should see light soon." Thus far, we were only guided by the jacket lights. I felt the nausea only a split second before they attacked. At a T intersection, 7 Strigoi jumped us. They'd let the earlier party escape, but they'd been lying in wait for us. 3 on one side and 4 on the other. One guardian, Alan, never saw it coming. A Strigoi grabbed him and snapped Alan's neck so quickly that it looked effortless. It probably was. It was such a mirror to what had happened to Mason that I nearly came to a standstill. Instead, I doubled back, ready to get into the fray. But we were in a narrow part of the tunnel, and not all of us could get through to the Strigoi. I was stuck in the back. Ms. Carmack was beside me, and she had enough visibility to light up a couple of the Strigoi, making it easier for those guardians in the fight to stake them. Alberta caught a glimpse of me and a couple other guardians. "Start retreating," she yelled. None of us wanted to leave, but there wasn't much we could do. I saw one guardian fall, and my heart lurched. I hadn't known him, but it didn't matter. In seconds, my mother was on the Strigoi attacker, driving her stake through his heart. Then I lost sight of the fight as I rounded another corner with the 3 guardians with me. Farther down the corridor, I saw faint purplish light. The exit. Faces of other guardians peered in at us. We'd made it. But where were the others? We ran to the exit, emerging into the air. My group clustered by the opening, anxious to see what had happened. The sun, I was dismayed to see, was nearly gone. The nausea hadn't left me, which meant Strigoi were still alive. Moments later, my mother's party came tearing down the hall. By the numbers, 1 more had gone down, but they were so close. Everyone around me tensed up. So close. So close. But not close enough. 3 Strigoi lay in wait in one of the alcoves. We'd passed them, but they'd let us go by. It all happened so fast. No one could have reacted in time. One of the Strigoi grabbed Celeste, his mouth and fangs going for her cheek. I heard a strangled scream and saw blood everywhere. One of the Strigoi went for Miss Carmack, but my mother jerked her away and shoved her forward toward us. The 3rd Strigoi grabbed Dimitri. In all the time I'd known him, I'd never seen Dimitri falter. He was always faster, always stronger than everyone else. Not this time. This Strigoi had caught him by surprise, and that slight edge was all it had taken. I stared. It was the blonde Strigoi, the one who had spoken to me in the battle. He grabbed Dimitri and pulled him to the ground. They grappled, strength against strength, and then I saw those fangs sink into Dimitri's neck. The red eyes flicked up and made contact with my own. I heard another scream. This time, it was my own. My mother started to double back toward the fallen, but then 5 more Strigoi appeared. It was chaos. I couldn't see Dimitri anymore. I couldn't see what had happened to him. Indecision flashed over my mother's features as she tried to decide to flee or fight. And then, regret all over her face. She kept running toward us and the exit. Meanwhile, I was trying to run back inside, but someone was stopping me. It was Stan. "What are you doing, Rose? More are coming." Didn't he understand? Dimitri was in there. I had to get Dimitri. My mother and Alberta burst out, dragging Miss Carmack. A group of Strigoi were after them, skidding to a halt just on the edge of the waning light. I was still fighting Stan. He didn't need the help, but my mother grasped a hold of me and tugged me away. "Rose, we have to get out of here." "He's in there!" I screamed, straining as hard as I could. How could I have killed Strigoi and not been able to break free from these 2? "Dimitri's in there! We have to go back for him! We can't leave him!" I was rambling, hysterical, shouting at them all that we had to go rescue Dimitri. My mother shook me hard and leaned close so there were only a couple inches between us. "He's dead, Rose. We can't go back in there. The sun will be down in 15 minutes and they're waiting for us. We're going to be in the dark before we can get back to the wards. We need every second we can get. It still may not be enough." I could see the Strigoi gathered at the entrance, their red eyes gleaming with anticipation. They completely filled the opening. 10, I believed. Maybe more. My mother was right. With their speed, even our 15-minute lead might not be enough. And yet, I still couldn't take a step. I couldn't stop staring at the cave back where Dimitri was, back where half of my soul was. He couldn't be dead. If he was, then surely I would be dead too. My mother slapped me, the pain snapping me out of my daze. "Run!" she yelled at me. "He is dead. You are not going to join him." I saw the panic in her own face, panic over me, her daughter, getting killed. I remembered Dmitri saying he'd rather die than see me dead, and if I stood there stupidly, letting the Strigoi get me, I'd fail both of them. "Run!" she cried again. Tears streaming down my face, I ran. Chapter 28. The next 12 hours were the longest in my life. Our group made it back to campus safely, though most of it was done at a run, which was hard with so many injured. The entire time I felt nauseous, presumably because Strigoi were near. If they were, they never caught up to us, and it's possible I was simply sick from everything that had happened in the caves. Once back behind the wards, the other novices and I were forgotten. We were safe, and the adults now had a lot of other things to concern themselves with. All of the captives had been rescued, all the ones that were alive. As I'd feared, the Strigoi had decided to munch on one before we got there. That meant we had rescued 12. 6 guardians, including Dmitri, had been lost. Those weren't bad numbers, considering how many Strigoi we'd faced, but when you look at the difference, it really meant we'd only saved 6 lives. Had the loss of all those guardians' lives been worth it? "You can't look at it that way," Eddie told me as we walked toward the clinic. Everyone, prisoners and raiders, had been ordered to get checked out. "You didn't just save those lives. You guys killed almost 30 Strigoi, plus the ones on campus. Think about all the people they would have killed. You essentially saved all those people's lives, too." A rational part of me knew he was right. But what did rationality have to do with anything when Dmitri might be dead? It was petty and selfish, but in that moment, I wanted to trade all those lives for his. He wouldn't have wanted that, though. I knew him. And through the tiniest, smallest chance, it was possible he wasn't dead. Even though the bite had looked pretty serious, that Strigoi could have incapacitated him and then fled. He could be lying in the caves right now, dying and in need of medical care. It drove me crazy, thinking of him like that, and us unable to help. There was no way we could go back, however. Not until daytime. Another party would go then to bring back our dead so that we could bury them. Until then, I had to wait. Dr. Olensky gave me a quick check, decided I didn't have a concussion, and then sent me on my way to bandage my own scrapes. She had too many others to worry about right now, who were in far worse condition. I knew the smart thing was to go to my dorm or to Lissa. I could have used the rest, and through the bond, I felt her calling to me. She was worried. She was afraid. I knew she'd find out the news soon, though. She didn't need me, and I didn't want to see her. I didn't want to see anyone. So rather than go to my dorm, I went to the chapel. I needed to do something until the caves could be checked out. Praying was as good an option as any. The chapel was usually empty in the middle of the day, but not this time. I shouldn't have been surprised. Considering the death and tragedy of the last 24 hours, it was only natural that people would seek comfort. Some sat alone, some sat in groups. They cried, they knelt, they prayed. Some simply stared off into space, clearly unable to believe what had happened. Father Andrew moved around the sanctuary, speaking to many of them. I found an empty pew in the very back corner and sat there. Drawing my knees up to me, I wrapped my arms around them and rested my head. On the walls, icons of saints and angels watched over all of us. Dmitri couldn't be dead. There was no way he could be. Surely, if he was, I would know. No one could take a life like that from the world. No one who had held me in bed like he had yesterday could really be gone. We had been too warm, too alive. Death couldn't follow something like that. Lissa's Chutki was around my wrist, and I ran my fingers over the cross and the beads. I tried desperately to put my thoughts into the forms of prayers, but I didn't know how. If God was real, I figured he was powerful enough to know what I wanted without me actually saying the right words. Hours passed. People came and went. I got tired of sitting and eventually stretched myself across the length of the pew. From the gold-painted ceiling, more saints and angels stared down at me. So much divine help, I thought. But what good were they really doing? I didn't even realize I'd fallen asleep until Lissa woke me up. She looked like an angel herself, the pale hair hanging long and loose around her face. Her eyes were as gentle and compassionate as those of the saints. "Rose," she said, "we've been looking all over for you. Have you been here the entire time?" I sat up, feeling tired and bleary-eyed. Considering I hadn't slept the night before, and I had gone on a massive raid, my fatigue was understandable. "Pretty much," I told her. She shook her head. "That was hours ago. You should go eat something." "I'm not hungry." "Hours ago." I clutched her arm. "What time is it? Has the sun come up?" "No. It's still about, 5 hours away." 5 hours. Could I wait that long? Lissa touched my face. I felt magic burn through our bond, and then the warm and cold tingling coursed through my own skin. Bruises and cuts disappeared. "You shouldn't do that," I said. A faint smile crossed her lips. "I've been doing it all day. I've been helping Dr. Olenski." "I heard about that, but wow, just feels so strange. We've always kept it hidden, you know?" "It doesn't matter if everyone knows now," she said with a shrug. "After everything that's happened, I had to help. So many people are hurt, and if it means my secret getting out, well, it had to happen sooner or later. Adrian's been helping too, though he can't do as much." And then it hit me. I straightened up. "Oh my God, Liz, you can save him. You can help Dimitri." Deep sorrow filled her face and the bond. "Rose," she said quietly, "they say Dimitri's dead." "No," I said. "He can't be. You don't understand. I think he was just injured, probably badly, but if you're there when they bring him back, you can heal him." Then the craziest thought of all came to me. "And if he did die?" The words hurt coming out. "You could bring him back, just like with me. He'd be shadow-kissed too." Her face grew even sadder. Sorrow, for me now, radiated out of her. "I can't do that. Bringing people back from the dead is a huge power drain. And besides, I don't think I could do it on someone who has been dead, that long. I think it has to be recent." I could hear the crazy desperation in my own voice. "But you have to try." "I can't." She swallowed. "You heard what I said to the Queen. I meant it. I can't go around bringing every dead person back to life. That gets into the kind of abuse Victor wanted. It's why we kept this secret." "You'd let him die? You wouldn't do this? You wouldn't do this for me?" I wasn't shouting, but my voice was definitely too loud for a church. Most everyone was gone now, and with the level of grief around here, I doubted anyone thought too much of an outburst. "I would do anything for you. You know that. And you won't do this for me?" I was on the verge of sobbing. Lissa studied me, a million thoughts swirling in her mind. She assessed my words, my face, my voice, and like that, she finally got it. She finally realized what I felt for Dimitri, that it was more than a teacher-student bond. I felt the knowledge light up in her mind. Countless connections suddenly came together for her. Comments I'd made, ways that Dimitri and I acted around each other. It all made sense to her now, things she'd been too blind to notice. Questions immediately sprang up too, but she didn't ask any of them or even mention what she'd realized. Instead, she just took my hand in hers and pulled me close. "I'm so sorry, Rose. I'm so sorry. I can't." I let her drag me away after that, presumably to get food. But when I sat at the cafeteria table and stared at the tray in front of me, the thought of eating anything made me sicker than being around the Strigoi had. She gave up after that, realizing nothing was going to happen until I knew what had happened to Dimitri. We went up to her room, and I lay down on the bed. She sat near me, but I didn't want to talk, and I soon fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, it was my mother beside me. "Rose, we're going to check the caves. You can't go into them, but you can come to the school's borders with us if you want." It was the best I could get. If it meant I could find out what had happened to Dimitri a moment sooner than if I stayed here, I'd do it. Lissa came with me, and we trailed behind the assembled Guardian party. I was still hurt by her refusal to heal Dimitri, but a part of me secretly thought she wouldn't be able to hold back once she saw him. The Guardians had assembled a large group to check the caves, just in case. We were pretty sure the Strigoi were gone, however. They'd lost their advantage, and had to know that if we came back for the dead, it would be with renewed numbers. Any of them that had survived would be gone. The Guardians crossed over the wards, and the rest of us who had followed along waited by the border. Hardly anyone spoke. It would probably be 3 hours before they came back, counting travel time. Trying to ignore the dark, leaden feeling inside of me, I sat on the ground and rested my head against Lissa's shoulder, wishing the minutes would fly by. A Moroi fire user created a bonfire, and we all warmed ourselves by it. The minutes didn't fly, but they did eventually pass. Someone shouted that the Guardians were coming back. I leapt up and ran to look. What I saw drove me to a halt. Stretchers. Stretchers carrying the bodies of those who had been killed. Dead Guardians, their faces pale and eyes unseeing. One of the watching Moroi went and threw up in a bush. Lissa started crying. One by one the dead filed past us. I stared, feeling cold and empty, wondering if I'd seen their ghosts the next time I went outside the wards. Finally, the whole group had gone by. 5 bodies, but it had felt like 500. And there was one body I hadn't seen, one I'd been dreading. I ran up to my mother. She was helping carry a stretcher. She wouldn't look at me, and undoubtedly knew what I'd come to ask. "Where's Dimitri?" I demanded. "Is he—" It was too much to hope for, too much to ask. "Is he alive?" Oh, God, what if my prayers had been answered? What if he was back there, injured, waiting for them to send a doctor? My mother didn't answer right away. I barely recognized her voice when she did. "He wasn't there, Rose." I stumbled over the uneven ground and had to hurry up to catch her again. "Wait, what's that mean? Maybe he's injured and left to get help." She still wouldn't look at me. Molly wasn't there either. Molly was the Moroi who had been snacked on. She was my age, tall and beautiful. I'd seen her body in the cave, drained of blood. She had definitely been dead. There was no way she'd been injured and staggered out. Molly and Dimitri, both their bodies gone. "No!" I gasped out. "You don't think—" A tear leaked out of my mother's eye. I'd never seen anything like that from her. I don't know what to think, Rose. If he survived, it's possible. It's possible they took him for later. The thought of Dmitri as a snack was too horrible for words, but it wasn't as horrible as the alternative. We both knew it. But they wouldn't have taken Molly for later. She'd been dead a while. My mother nodded. I'm sorry, Rose. We can't know for sure. It's likely they're both just dead, and the Strigoi dragged their bodies off. She was lying. It was the first time in my entire life that my mother had ever told me a lie to protect me. She wasn't the comforting kind, wasn't the kind who would make up pretty stories in order to make someone feel better. She always told the harsh truth. Not this time. I stopped walking, and the group continued filing past me. Lissa caught up, worried and confused. What's happening? She asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and ran backwards, back toward the wards. She ran after me, calling my name. No one else noticed us because, honestly, who in the world was stupid enough to cross the wards after everything that had happened? I was, although in daylight I had nothing to fear. I ran past the place Jessie's group had attacked her, stepping across the invisible lines that marked the boundaries of the Academy's grounds. Lissa hesitated a moment, and then joined me. She was breathless from running after me. Rose, what are you— Mason! I cried. Mason, I need you! It took him a little while to materialize. This time, he not only seemed ultra-pale, he also appeared to be flickering, like a light about to go out. He stood there, watching me, and although his expression was the same as always, I had the weirdest feeling that he knew what I was going to ask. Lissa, beside me, kept glancing back and forth between me and the spot I was speaking to. Mason, is Dmitri dead? Mason shook his head. Is he alive? Mason shook his head. Neither alive nor dead. The world swam around me, sparkles of color dancing before my eyes. The lack of food had made me dizzy, and I was on the verge of fainting. I had to stay in control here. I had to ask the next question. Out of all the victims they could have chosen, surely they wouldn't have picked him. The next words stuck in my throat, and I sank to my knees as I spoke them. Is Dmitri a Strigoi? Mason hesitated only a moment, like he was afraid to answer me, and then he nodded. My heart shattered. My world shattered. You will lose what you value most. It hadn't been me that Rhonda was talking about. It hadn't even been Dimitri's life. What you value most. It had been his soul. Chapter 29. Nearly a week later, I showed up at Adrian's door. We hadn't had classes since the attack, but our normal curfew hours were still in effect. It was almost bedtime. Adrian's face registered complete and total shock when he saw me. It was the first time I'd ever sought him out, rather than vice versa. "Little Dampier," he said, stepping aside. "Come in." I did, and was nearly overwhelmed by the smell of alcohol as I passed him. The Academy's guest housing was nice, but he clearly hadn't done much to keep his suite clean. I had a feeling he'd probably been drinking non-stop since the attack. The TV was on, and a small table by the couch held a half-empty bottle of vodka. I picked it up and read the label. It was in Russian. "Bad time?" I asked, setting it back down. "Never a bad time for you," he told me, gallantly. His face looked haggard, He was still as good-looking as ever, but there were dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't been sleeping well. He waved me toward an armchair and sat down on the couch. "Haven't seen much of you." I leaned back. "I haven't wanted to be seen," I admitted. I'd hardly spoken to anyone since the attack. I'd spent a lot of time by myself, or with Lissa. I took comfort from being around her, but we hadn't said much. She understood that I needed to process things and had simply been there for me, not pushing me on things I didn't want to talk about, even though there were a dozen things she wanted to ask. The Academy's dead had been honored in one group memorial service, although their families had made arrangements for each person's respective funeral. I'd gone to the larger service. The chapel had been packed, with standing room only. Father Andrew had read the names of the dead, listing Dimitri and Molly among them. No one was talking about what had really happened to them. There was too much other grief anyway. We were drowning in it. No one even knew how the Academy would pick up the pieces and start running again. "You look worse than I do," I told Adrian. I didn't think that was possible. He brought the bottle to his lips and took a long drink. "Nah, you always look good. As for me, well, it's hard to explain. The auras are getting to me. There's so much sorrow around here. You can't even begin to understand. It radiates from everyone on a spiritual level. It's overwhelming. It makes your dark aura downright cheerful." "Is that why you're drinking?" "Yup. It shut my aura vision right off, thankfully, so I can't give you a report today." He offered me the bottle, and I shook my head. He shrugged and took another drink. "So, what can I do for you, Rose? I have a feeling you aren't here to check on me." He was right, and I only felt a little bad about what I was here for. I'd done a lot of thinking this last week. Processing my grief for Mason had been hard. In fact, I hadn't even really quite resolved it when the ghost business had started. Now I had to mourn all over again. After all, more than Dimitri had been lost. Teachers had died, guardians and Moroi alike. None of my close friends had died, but people I knew from classes had. They'd been students at the Academy as long as I had, and it was weird to think I'd never see them again. That was a lot of loss to deal with, a lot of people to say goodbye to. But Dimitri, he was a different case. After all, how did you say goodbye to someone who wasn't exactly gone? That was the problem. "I need money," I told Adrian, not bothering with pretense. He arched an eyebrow. "Unexpected, from you at least. I get that kind of request a lot from others. Pray tell, what would I be funding?" I glanced away from him, focusing on the television. It was a commercial for some kind of deodorant. "I'm leaving the Academy," I said, finally. "Also unexpected. You're only a few months out from graduation." I met his eyes. "It doesn't matter. I have things to do now." "I never figured you'd be one of the dropout guardians. You going to join the Blood Whores?" "No," I said. "Of course not." "Don't act so offended. That's not an unreasonable assumption. If you're not going to be a guardian, what else are you going to do?" "I told you. I have things I have to take care of." He arched an eyebrow. "Things that are going to get you into trouble?" I shrugged. He laughed. "Stupid question, huh? Everything you do gets you in trouble." He propped his elbow up on the couch's arm and rested his chin in his hand. "Why'd you come to me for money?" "Because you have it." This also made him laugh. "And why do you think I'll give it to you?" I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, forcing as much womanly charm as I could into my expression. His smile went away, and his green eyes narrowed in frustration. He jerked his gaze away. "Damn it, Rose, don't do that. Not now. You're playing on how I feel about you. It's not fair." He gulped more vodka. He was right. I'd come to him because I thought I could use his crush to get what I wanted. It was low, but I had no choice. Getting up, I moved over and sat beside him. I held his hand. "Please, Adrian," I said. "Please help me. You're the only one I can go to." "That's not fair," he repeated, slurring his words a little. "You're using those come-hither eyes on me, but it's not me you want. It's never been me. It's always been Belikov, and God only knows what you'll do now that he's gone." He was right about that, too. "Will you help me?" I asked, still playing up the charisma. "You're the only one I could talk to. The only one who really understands me." "Are you coming back?" he countered. "Eventually." Tipping his head back, he exhaled a heavy breath. His hair, which I'd always thought looked stylishly messy, simply looked messy today. "Maybe it's for the best if you leave. Maybe you'll get over him faster if you go away for a while. Wouldn't hurt to be away from Lissa's aura either. It might slow yours from darkening. Stop this rage you always seem to be in. You need to be happier and stop seeing ghosts." My seduction faltered for a moment. "Lissa isn't why I'm seeing ghosts. Well, she is, but not in the way you think. I see the ghosts because I'm shadow-kissed. I'm tied to the world of the dead, and the more I kill, the stronger that connection becomes. It's why I see the dead and why I feel weird when Strigoi are near. I can sense them now. They're tied to that world, too." He frowned. "You're saying the auras mean nothing? That you aren't taking away the effects of spirit?" "No, that's happening too. That's why this has all been so confusing. I thought there was just one thing going on, but there have been two. I see the ghosts because of being shadow-kissed. I'm getting upset and angry, bad even, because I'm taking away Lissa's dark side. That's why my aura's darkening, why I'm getting so enraged lately. Right now, it just sort of plays out as a really bad temper." I frowned, thinking of the night Dmitri had stopped me from going after Jessie. But I don't know what it'll turn into next. Adrian sighed. "Why is everything so complicated with you?" "Will you help me? Please, Adrian." I ran my fingers along his hand. "Please help me." Low. Low. This was so low of me, but it didn't matter. Only Dmitri did. Finally, Adrian looked back at me. For the first time ever, he looked vulnerable. "When you come back, will you give me a fair shot?" I hid my surprise. "What do you mean?" "It's like I said. You've never wanted me, never even considered me. The flowers, the flirting, it rolled right off you. You were so gone for him, and nobody noticed. If you go do your thing, will you take me seriously? Will you give me a chance when you return?" I stared. I definitely hadn't expected this. My initial instinct was to say no, that I could never love anybody again, that my heart had been shattered along with that piece of my soul that Dmitri held. But Adrian was looking at me so earnestly, and there was none of his joking nature. He meant what he said, and I realized all the affection for me he'd always teased about hadn't been a joke either. Lissa had been right about his feelings. "Will you?" he repeated. "God only knows what you'll do now that he's gone." "Of course." Not an honest answer, but a necessary one. Adrian looked away and drank more vodka. There wasn't much left. When are you leaving? Tomorrow. Setting the bottle down, he stood up and walked off into the bedroom. He returned with a large stack of cash. I wondered if he kept it under his bed or something. He handed it to me wordlessly, and then picked up the phone and made some calls. The sun was up, and the human world, which handled most Moroi money, was also up and awake. I tried to watch TV while he talked, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept wanting to scratch the back of my neck. Because there was no way of knowing exactly how many Strigoi I and the others had killed, we'd all been given a different kind of tattoo instead of the usual set of Molnia marks. I'd forgotten its name, but this tattoo looked like a little star. It meant that the bearer had been in a battle and killed many Strigoi. When he finally finished his calls, Adrian handed me a piece of paper. It had the name and address of a bank in Missoula. Go there, he said. I'm guessing you have to go to Missoula first anyway, if you're actually going on to anywhere civilized. There's an account set up, for you, with a lot of money in it. Talk to them, and they'll finish the paperwork with you. I stood up and stuffed the bills in my jacket. Thank you, I said. Without hesitating, I reached out and hugged him. The scent of vodka was overpowering, but I felt I owed him. I was taking advantage of his feelings for me in order to further my own devices. He put his arms around me and held me for several seconds before letting go. I brushed my lips against his cheek as we broke apart, and I thought he might stop breathing. I won't forget this, I murmured in his ear. I don't suppose you'll tell me where you're going, he asked. No, I said. I'm sorry. Just keep your promise and come back. I didn't actually use the word promise, I pointed out. He smiled and pressed a kiss to my forehead. You're right. I'm going to miss you, little Dampier. Be careful. If you ever need anything, let me know. I'll be waiting for you. I thanked him again and left, not bothering to tell him he might be waiting a long time. There was a very real possibility that I might not be coming back. The next day I got up early, long before most of campus was awake. I'd hardly slept. I slung a bag over my shoulder and walked over to the main office in the administrative building. The office wasn't opened yet either, so I sat down on the floor in the hallway outside of it, studying my hands as I waited. I noticed 2 tiny flecks of gold on my thumbnail. They were the only remnants of my manicure. About 20 minutes later, the secretary showed up with the keys and let me in. What can I do for you? She asked, once she was seated at her desk. I handed her a stack of papers I'd been holding. I'm withdrawing. Her eyes widened to impossible size. But, what? You can't. I tapped the stack. I can. It's all filled out. Still gaping, she muttered something to me about waiting, and then scurried out of the room. A few minutes later, she returned with Head Mistress Kirova. Kirova had apparently been briefed and was looking at me very disapprovingly down her beak-like nose. Miss Hathaway, what's the meaning of this? I'm leaving, I said. Quitting, dropping out, whatever. You can't do that, she said. Well, obviously I can, since you guys keep withdrawal paperwork in the library. It's all filled out the way it needs to be. Her anger changed into something sadder and more anxious. I know a lot has gone on lately. We're all having trouble adjusting, but that's no reason to make a hasty decision. If anything, we need you more than ever. She was almost pleading. Hard to believe she'd wanted to expel me 6 months ago. This wasn't hasty. I said. I thought a lot about it. Let me at least get your mother so we can talk this out. She left for Europe 3 days ago. Not that it matters anyway. I pointed to the line on the top form that said, date of birth. I'm 18 today. She can't do anything anymore. This is my choice. Now, will you stamp the form, or are you actually going to try to restrain me? Pretty sure I could take you in a fight, Kirova. They stamped my packet, not happily. The secretary made a copy of the official paper that declared I was no longer a student at St. Vladimir's Academy. I'd need it to get out the main gate. It was a long walk from the front of the school, and the western sky was red as the sun slipped over the horizon. The weather had warmed up, even at night. Spring had finally come. It made for good walking weather, since I had a ways to go before I made it to the highway. From there, I'd hitchhike to Missoula. Hitchhiking wasn't safe, but the silver stake in my coat pocket made me feel pretty secure about anything I'd face. No one had taken it away from me after the raid, and it would work just as well against creepy humans as it did with Strigoi. I could just make out the gates when I sensed her. Lissa. I stopped walking and turned toward a cluster of bud-covered trees. She was standing in them, perfectly still, and had managed to hide her thoughts so well that I hadn't realized she was practically right next to me. Her hair and eyes glowed in the sunset, and she seemed too beautiful and too ethereal to be part of this dreary landscape. "Hey," I said. "Hey." She wrapped her arms around herself, cold even in her coat. Maroi didn't have the same resistance to temperature changes that Dampiers did. What I found warm and spring-like was still chilly to her. "I knew it," she said. "Ever since that day they said his body was gone, something told me you'd do this. I was just waiting." "Can you read my mind now?" I asked, ruefully. "No, I can just read you. Finally. I can't believe how blind I was. I can't believe I never noticed. Victor's comment. He was right." She glanced off at the sunset, then turned her gaze back on me. A flash of anger, both in her feelings and her eyes, hit me. "Why didn't you tell me?" she cried. "Why didn't you tell me you loved Dmitri?" I stared. I couldn't remember the last time Lissa had yelled at anyone. Maybe last fall, when all the Victor insanity had gone down. Loud outbursts were my thing, not hers. Even when torturing Jessie, her voice had been deadly quiet. "I couldn't tell anyone," I said. "I'm your best friend, Rose. We've been through everything together. Do you really think I would have told? I would have kept it a secret?" I looked at the ground. "I know you would have. I don't know. I couldn't talk about it. Not even to you. I can't explain it." "How?" She groped for the question her mind had already formed. "How serious was it? Was it just you, or—" "It was both of us," I told her. "He felt the same, but we knew we couldn't be together. Not with our age and, well, not when we were supposed to be protecting you." Lissa frowned. "What do you mean?" "Dmitri always said that if we were involved, we'd worry more about protecting each other than you. We couldn't do that." Guilt coursed through her at the thought that she'd been responsible for keeping us apart. "It's not your fault," I said quickly. "Surely, there must have been a way. It wouldn't have been a problem." I shrugged, unwilling to think about or mention our last kiss in the forest, back when Dmitri and I had thought we'd figure out a solution to all of our problems. "I don't know," I said. "We just tried to stay apart. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't." Her mind was a tumble of emotions. She felt sorry for me, but at the same time she was mad. "You should have told me," she repeated. "I feel like you don't trust me." Of course I trust you. Is that why you're sneaking off? That has nothing to do with trust, I admitted. It's me. Well, I didn't want to tell you. I couldn't bear to tell you I was leaving, or explain why. I already know, she said. I figured it out. How? I asked. Lissa was full of surprises today. I was there, last fall when we took that van into Missoula, the shopping trip. You and Dmitri were talking about Strigoi, about how becoming one makes you something twisted and evil, how it destroys the person you used to be and makes you do horrible things. And I heard... She had trouble saying it. I had trouble hearing it, and my eyes grew wet. The memory was too harsh. Thinking of sitting with him that day, back when we were first falling in love. Lissa swallowed and continued. I heard you both say you'd rather die than become a monster like that. Silence fell between us. The wind picked up and blew our hair around, dark and light. I have to do this, Liz. I have to do it for him. No, she said firmly. You don't have to. You didn't promise him anything. Not in words, no, but you don't understand. I understand that you're trying to cope, and that this is as good a way as any. You need to find another way to let him go. I shook my head. I have to do this. Even if it means leaving me? The way she said it, the way she looked at me. God, a flood of memories flitted through my mind. We'd been together since childhood, inseparable, bound, and yet Dmitri and I had been connected too. Damn it, I'd never wanted to have to choose between them. I have to do this, I said yet again. I'm sorry. You're supposed to be my guardian and go with me to college, she argued. You're shadow-kissed. We're supposed to be together. If you leave me... The ugly coil of darkness was starting to raise its head in my chest. My voice was tight when I spoke. If I leave you, they'll get you another guardian. 2 of them. You're the last Dragomir. They'll keep you safe. But they won't be you, Rose, she said. Those luminous green eyes held mine, and the anger in me cooled. She was so beautiful, so sweet, and she seemed so reasonable. She was right. I owed it to her. I needed to. Stop it! I yelled, turning away. She'd been using her magic. Do not use compulsion on me. You're my friend. Friends don't use their powers on each other. Friends don't abandon each other, she snapped back. If you were my friend, you wouldn't do it. I spun back toward her, careful not to look too closely into her eyes, in case she tried compulsion on me again. The rage in me exploded. It's not about you, okay? This time it's about me, not you. All my life, Lissa. All my life it's been the same. They come first. I've lived my life for you. I've trained to be your shadow. But you know what? I want to come first. I need to take care of myself for once. I'm tired of looking out for everyone else and having to put aside what I want. Dmitri and I did that, and look what happened. He's gone. I will never hold him again. Now I owe it to him to do this. I'm sorry if it hurts you, but it's my choice. I'd shouted the words, not even pausing for a breath, and I hoped my voice hadn't carried to the guardians on duty at the gate. Lissa was staring at me, shocked and hurt. Tears ran down her cheeks, and part of me shriveled up at hurting the person I'd sworn to protect. You love him more than me, she said in a small voice, sounding very young. He needs me right now. I need you. He's gone, Rose. No, I said, but he will be soon. I reached up my sleeve and took off the tchotchke she'd given me for Christmas. I held it out to her. She hesitated and then took it. "What's this for?" she asked. "I can't wear it. It's for a Dragomir guardian. I'll take it again when I had almost said if, not when. I think she knew that. When I get back." Her hands closed around the beads. "Please, Rose, please don't leave me." "I'm sorry," I said. There were no other words to offer up. "I'm sorry." I left her there crying as I walked toward the gate. A piece of my soul had died when Dmitri had fallen. Turning my back on her now, I felt another piece die as well. Soon there wouldn't be anything left inside of me. The guardians at the gate were as shocked as the secretary and Kirova had been, but there was nothing they could do. Happy birthday to me, I thought bitterly. 18 at last. It was nothing like I had expected. They opened the gates, and I stepped through, outside of the school's grounds and over the wards. The lines were invisible, but I felt strangely vulnerable and exposed, as if I'd leapt a great chasm. And yet, at the same time, I felt free and in control. I started walking down the narrow road. The sun was nearly gone. I'd have to rely on moonlight soon. When I was out of earshot of the guardians, I stopped and spoke. "Mason." I had to wait a long time. When he appeared, I could barely see him at all. He was almost completely transparent. "It's time, isn't it? You're going. You're finally moving on to—" Well, I had no clue where he was moving on to. I didn't know anymore what lay beyond, whether it was the realms Father Andrew believed in, or some entirely different world that I'd visited. Nonetheless, Mason understood and nodded. "It's been more than 40 days, I mused. "So I guess you're overdue. I'm glad. I hope you find peace. Although I kind of hoped you'd be able to lead me to him." Mason shook his head, and he didn't need to say a word for me to understand what he wanted to tell me. "You're on your own now, Rose." "It's okay. You deserve your rest. Besides, I think I know where to start looking." I'd thought about this constantly over the last week. If Dmitri was where I believed he was, I had a lot of work ahead of me. Mason's help would have been nice, but I didn't want to keep bothering him. It seemed like he had enough to deal with. "Goodbye," I told him. "Thanks for your help. I'll miss you." His form grew fainter and fainter, and just before it went all together, I saw the hint of a smile, that laughing and mischievous smile I'd loved so much. For the first time since his death, thinking about Mason no longer devastated me. I was sad, and I really would miss him, but I knew he'd moved on to something good, something really good. I no longer felt guilty. Turning away, I stared at the long road winding off ahead of me. I sighed. This trip might take a while. "Then start walking, Rose," I muttered to myself. I set off to kill the man I loved. This has been an Audible.com and Penguin Young Readers Group production. Music by Michael Whalen. Copyright 2008 by Rochelle Mead. Audio recording copyright 2008 by Penguin Group USA Incorporated.